Wyoming Territory, May of 1883. The wind cut hard across the high plains near Buffalo, dust catching in the sun like ash over a battlefield. Delia O'Hara stepped off the stagecoach with a trembling hand on her satchel, her boots hitting the dirt like a final sentence. The hem of her blue traveling dress was stiff with dust from the trail. Her heart pounded so hard in her chest she could hardly see straight. She had come west as a mail-order bride, answering a printed letter from a man named Roy Whitlow, a rancher he had called himself. 33, widowed, seeking a good woman to help raise a home. His words had been kind on paper, but the man who met her was not the man from the letters. Roy's eyes were sharp and cold, like river ice. He said nothing when she stepped down, just took her satchel and turned. No greeting, no smile, just a rough hand grabbing her arm and dragging her toward his waiting wagon. That first night, he didn't speak a single word at dinner. The silence was louder than a gunshot. By the end of the week, he'd slapped her for dropping a plate. By the end of the month, she'd learned not to flinch unless the door creaked open after dark. 2 months in, she no longer cried. She didn't have any tears left. Roy's ranch was 2 miles out of town, tucked behind a ridge of cottonwoods and sharp rock. No neighbors close enough to hear anything. Just her and him, and sometimes the whiskey that made him worse. He never let her go to town alone. But that morning, Roy had been nursing a broken hand. He'd smashed it into the doorframe during a rage, and the doctor had sent for more salve. He cursed the whole time and shoved a coin into her palm. You get the medicine. You speak to no one. You come back fast, or you'll wish you hadn't. Delia nodded. Her voice had stopped working weeks ago around him. She took the wagon and rode hard toward town, past the buttes and the dry creek beds, until the rooftops of Buffalo came into view. That was when the wheel caught a rut, and the wagon pitched sideways. It was not the fall that scared her, it was the thought of Roy's belt when he saw the damage. She scrambled out, ankle twisted and bleeding, trying to lift the broken wheel herself. She pushed and shoved, teeth clenched, until a shadow blocked the sun. You all right, miss? She looked up. He was tall, lean, with sun-dark skin and a quiet strength in the way he stood. Dust hung on his hat and shoulders. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, showing strong forearms. His horse stood behind him, reins looped loose around the saddle horn. I can fix it, she said, trying to lift the wheel again, even though her hands were shaking. He stepped forward anyway. Let me help. She backed off, wary. Roy had taught her not to trust kindness. He crouched by the wagon, studied the wheel, then looked up at her with calm eyes. Name's Boone Callahan. You from around here? No, she said quickly, then added, Delia O'Hara. Well, Delia O'Hara, you got a busted wheel and a split lip. I can fix the first one. Might take longer for the second. She touched her mouth without thinking. The bruise had bloomed purple 2 nights ago. Boone said nothing else. Just worked the wheel off, his movements steady, careful. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't press. But when the job was done, and she tried to thank him, her voice cracked. You need a ride into town? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her onto his horse like she weighed nothing, then climbed up behind her, careful not to touch her more than he had to. The ride was quiet, the wind tugging at her hair. She had not felt safe in months, but something about Boone made her shoulders drop a little. At the general store, she bought the salve. Boone waited outside. She almost walked past him, back toward the broken wagon. But her legs stopped moving. He turned. You all right? I am married, she said quickly. You should not speak to me again. He nodded once. All right, but she saw something in his face. Not pity, just quiet understanding. She turned and walked back to the wagon, climbed up with effort, and drove home. That night, Roy was waiting on the porch. He saw the broken wheel, The bruised ankle, the dust on her dress, and his eyes went dark. "You think I am stupid?" he barked. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" He dragged her from the wagon by the arm. She hit the ground hard. "I saw you riding with him. You think I won't skin you for that?" She did not answer. She just curled in tight, waiting. That was when the hoofbeats came. Fast. Hard. Then Boone was there. He dismounted before the horse could stop, stormed up the porch steps like he had fire in his blood. Roy turned with a sneer. "You got some nerve showing up here, cowboy. I saw your wife crying in the dirt. That is all I needed. She is my wife. You do not get a say." Boone stepped between Roy and Delia. "I do when a man raises his hand to a woman." Roy swung first. Boone took the hit, then drove his fist into Roy's gut, then another to the jaw. They fought dirty grit, fists, elbows. Boone took a few hits but gave more. Delia watched, frozen, until Roy finally collapsed, bleeding and groaning in the dust. Boone knelt beside her. "Come with me." She stared at him wide-eyed. "He will find us. Let him try." He helped her up gently, held her close as she limped. She felt his heartbeat against her side. Strong. Steady. That night, he took her to a small cabin outside town. His home. Clean. Quiet. He cooked her beans and cornbread and let her sleep in his bed while he took the floor. Delia woke in the middle of the night, breath caught in her throat. He was by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the trees. "You do not have to protect me," she whispered. He turned. "I want to." She felt something shift inside her, like a door creaking open. She stepped toward him, sat beside him on the floor. "I do not know how to be loved," she said softly. Boone looked at her, his eyes warm. "Then let me show you. Slow if you need. Or not at all if you choose." She reached for his hand, held it tight, and for the first time in months she felt safe. Not because Roy was gone, but because Boone was here. Dawn found the cabin wrapped in mist, the kind that clung low to the grass and softened every edge. Boone stepped outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder, boots sinking into the dew-heavy soil. The air smelled of pine and last night's rain. He scanned the ridgeline, listening for hooves, voices, anything out of place. Nothing stirred but a lone magpie in the cottonwoods. Inside, Delia stood barefoot beside the small hearth, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. The fire hadn't burned down all the way, and its warmth reached her through her thin sleeves. Her eyes lingered on the door Boone had passed through, her fingers tightening slightly on the tin. When he returned, he set his rifle by the door and peeled off his coat. "Still quiet out there," he said, voice low. "No sign of him." Delia didn't answer at first. Then, "You think he'll come?" Boone poured himself a mug, sat down on the bench across from her. "A man like that don't take losing easy. But he's hurt, and he knows better than to come blind. If he comes, he'll wait." She looked down at her mug. "Waiting's harder than running." He nodded. "That it is." They sat in silence a while, the kind that didn't press too hard. Then Delia said, "You live here alone?" "For a while now." He sipped his coffee, slow and steady. "My brother and I built this place back when the railroad came through. He took work north, ended up marrying a girl in Montana. I stayed." She glanced around. The cabin was plain but solid, rough-hewn walls, a washstand tucked in the corner, shelves lined with tools and jars. Everything had its place. "You built it with your own hands?" "Every board." She nodded. "It feels safe here." He didn't say anything to that, just reached for the poker and stirred the coals. Later that morning, Boone hitched his wagon and rode into town for supplies. Delia stayed behind, her ankle wrapped and resting on a stool. She swept the floor, folded the blanket where he'd slept, and found herself lingering at the window. Every time wind touched the grass, her breath caught. By early afternoon, she heard the wagon returning. She stepped outside, careful on the porch steps. Boone climbed down and lifted a small crate from the back. Brought some flour, beans, a few things from the smith's. He paused. Also left word with Sheriff Lawton. Delia's hands went still on the porch rail. Won't that make things worse? Boone met her eyes. Sheriff's not the kind to turn away from a woman bleeding in the dirt. He'll watch the roads. Roy won't get close without someone noticing. She followed him inside, watching as he unpacked the supplies. He moved with the calm of someone used to stillness, used to waiting out storms instead of outrunning them. That night, she cooked while he cleaned his saddle gear. Outside, the moon hung low and gold over the trees. When they sat to eat, she asked, "Do you believe a person can change?" He set down his fork. "You mean someone like him?" "I mean someone like me." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "You didn't do wrong, Delia. I chose to come west. I answered his letter. I walked into it with both eyes open. No one chooses to be hurt," he said, quiet but firm. "And no decent man expects a woman to fix his pain for him." She didn't speak again until the plates were cleared. Then, "I used to play piano, back in Ohio. My father taught me." "What kind of songs?" "Old ones. Hymns mostly. Some reels, some waltzes. He played better than I ever did." "You miss it?" "Every day." He nodded, then stood and walked to a small chest near the hearth. From it, he pulled a folded cloth and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a harmonica, worn silver with the initials JC scratched into one side. "My brother left this behind," he said. "I ain't much for tunes, but I figure it ought to be played." He handed it to her. She turned it over in her hands, eyes filling with something soft. "You sure?" He nodded once. She raised it to her lips and played a slow, wavering note. Then another. The melody that followed was hesitant but clear, a hymn, old and mournful, the kind sung at funerals and fences alike. Boone leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. When she finished, the silence that followed was rich, not empty. "I didn't think I'd play again," she said. "You don't have to stop now." She smiled, just barely. "Tomorrow." He stood and banked the fire. "You'll have the bed tonight. I'll take the floor again." She didn't argue, just touched the harmonica once more before setting it down on the table, close to his reach. When she lay under the quilt, the wind outside had quieted, but inside her chest, something stirred, something that didn't ache or tremble or brace for harm. She listened to Boone's breathing across the room, even, steady. She closed her eyes and let sleep come without fear. The next morning opened with the hush of snowmelt dripping from the eaves. May had turned colder overnight, and a thin sheen of frost clung to the cabin windows. Delia stepped outside wrapped in Boone's spare coat, her breath rising in pale ribbons. She stood still for a long while, watching the sun stretch over the far hill, the earth steaming where light touched it. A meadowlark called from the fence post, and she answered it in her head with the hymn she'd played the night before. Boone was already out beyond the pasture line, mending a wire fence that had sagged where elk had passed through during the thaw. He worked without hurry, shoulders moving steady under his worn flannel shirt, the back of his neck ruddy from sun and wind. Delia crossed the short yard and leaned against the gate, watching him work until he noticed her. "Fence won't hold much if the bottom stays loose," he said, tugging the last strand taut. She tilted her head. "You always fix things before they break?" He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward her. "Most things give you warning, if you're willing to look." She studied the stretch of land behind him, soft dips of earth, timothy grass just starting to green at the base. It's quiet out here. He nodded. I didn't realize how loud my life had been until it stopped. Boone didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space. He just leaned beside her against the gate. You got plans for what comes next? She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled around the wooden rail, nails still chipped from years of scrubbing and mending. I don't even know what next looks like. You ever think about teaching? Her brow creased. Teaching? There's a new schoolhouse going up north of town. They're looking for someone steady. I heard Mrs. Weller from the Mercantile talking about it. Thought of you. I haven't been in a schoolroom since I was 16. Doesn't mean you couldn't stand at the front of one. She looked away. I don't know what I'm fit for. Boone glanced toward the trees, then back at her. You're fit to choose. That's a start. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp pine. A hawk wheeled high above the ridge, its cry sharp against the morning hush. Later, while Boone rode out to check on a neighbor's cattle, Delia stayed behind and washed the linens. With his coat still draped around her, she hung the sheets over the line strung between two cottonwoods. The fabric snapped in the breeze, bright against the gray bark, and for a moment she imagined a life that didn't feel borrowed. Halfway through wringing out the pillowcases, she heard hoofbeats. Her hands paused in the basin. A rider crested the ridge beyond the pasture. Sheriff Lawton. He dismounted near the porch and gave a short nod. Ma'am. Delia stepped forward, drying her hands on her skirt. Something wrong? Not yet, but I figured you ought to know Roy's still in town. He's been spending nights behind the livery, drinking with that drifter from Cheyenne. No word he's been asking after you, but I doubt he's done. She swallowed hard. You think he'll come this way? Eventually. Men like him don't like being left, especially not by women they think they own. She nodded once. I'll ride by every other day, the sheriff said. More if you send word. Boone returned just after the sheriff left. She didn't speak of the visit until they sat down to supper, a meal of boiled potatoes and salt pork, with a bit of dried apple on the side. He's still nearby, she said, setting her fork down. The sheriff came. Boone didn't look startled, only thoughtful. Then we stay ready. Delia hesitated. I don't want you hurt for standing up for me. I'm not hurt, he said, voice even. And I didn't stand up for you. I stood up because it was right. She met his eyes across the table. I want to try. He didn't ask what she meant. He just waited. I want to try something honest. Something that's mine. I want to teach. I want to sleep without bracing myself. I want to wake up and not dread the day before it begins. Boone reached across the table, not fast, just steady, and placed his hand over hers. Then that's what we'll work toward. Her fingers curled into his. That night, when she lay in the bed beneath the patched quilt, she didn't hear him moving to the floor. She opened her eyes. You don't have to keep watch tonight. I know, he said, voice low. Still, he sat by the hearth, legs stretched out, back against the wall. She didn't ask him to come closer. She didn't need to. In the quiet, with only the fire breathing low and the wind brushing the shutters, Delia turned her face into the pillow and smiled, small, but whole. The schoolhouse wasn't much more than a frame and a roof when Delia first saw it, the walls half raised and the floorboards still waiting to be set. She stood beside Boone at the edge of the clearing, skirts brushing the grass, watching two men hoist a beam into place with ropes and grunts of effort. The smell of pine pitch and sawdust filled the air, sharp and clean. Reverend Tully said they'll be finished by early July, Boone said, adjusting his hat. He's the one helping head it up. Delia kept her arms tucked close, fingers tightening around the leather gloves Boone had brought her from town, too big, but warm. I don't know where to begin. You already did, he said, without turning his head. She looked at the school again. The windows hadn't been cut yet, and the door was only a gap in the wall, but she could picture it filled with benches, sunlight catching on chalk dust, young voices echoing against the wood. Boone motioned toward the wagon. "Want to meet the woman organizing the hiring?" Delia hesitated, then nodded. She followed him down the slope to where a woman in a dark shawl stood beside a crate of tools. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her boots were caked in mud. "Delia," Boone said, "this is Mrs. Redfern." The woman gave a nod. "You're the one Reverend mentioned. From back east." Delia returned the nod. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Redfern looked her over not unkindly, but not soft either. "You ever teach before?" "No, but I can read and write, and I'm willing to learn what I don't know." "Can you handle children who don't listen? Boys who throw stones? Girls who won't speak?" "I can," Delia said, voice steady. "I've learned how to keep my feet under me." Mrs. Redfern studied her a moment longer, then said, "Come back next week. We'll need help sanding floors and sorting books. School starts in August." Delia extended her hand. The older woman shook it, firm and quick. Back at the cabin, Boone unsaddled the horse and set to stacking the extra firewood he'd hauled. Delia carried in the last of the dry goods, beans, cornmeal, and a small tin of tea leaves he'd surprised her with. She set it gently on the shelf, her hands lingering on the lid. Later, while he sharpened a blade by the window, she sat nearby, mending a frayed shirt cuff. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked, not looking up. "I thought about Colorado once," Boone said, running the whetstone along the edge. "But I stayed. Too many things here that feel like home." She glanced at him. "Do you ever regret it?" He paused, turned the knife in his hand. "Not since you came here." The thread slipped from her fingers. She didn't reach for it. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere," she said after a long moment. "That I was meant to be moved around, passed over, like something borrowed." "You're not borrowed," he said. "You're not temporary." She rose, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. Her hand touched his knee, light as breath. "I want to stay," she said. He set the knife aside, cupped her face with a hand rough from work but careful in its touch. "Then stay." She leaned into him, forehead resting against his chest, and for a while, neither moved. Outside, the last of the frost melted from the eaves, falling in slow, quiet drops. That night, she stood by the washbasin, brushing her hair in long strokes. Boone sat on the edge of the bed, shirt unbuttoned, watching the fire burn down. "Will you come to bed?" she asked, turning slightly. He stood and crossed to her, pausing behind her shoulder. "Only if you want me to." She nodded, then reached back to take his hand. When they lay down, it was without urgency. His arm curved around her waist, and her fingers found the buttons of his shirt, undoing them one at a time. The warmth between them grew slowly, like light creeping across a cold floor. He kissed the hollow beneath her jaw, and her breath caught not from fear, but from the strange grace of being wanted. "You're safe," he whispered against her skin. "I know," she said, and meant it. They moved together like wind through grass, quiet, sure, and without rush. Afterward, she lay nestled against him, her cheek to his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I never believed I'd feel this," she said softly. "You earned it," he answered. "Every part." Sleep came to her like a tide, gentle and full. Boone stayed awake a while longer, his hand resting over hers, the fire throwing shadows across the beams above. He looked at her sleeping face, the softness there, the peace hard won, and something in him settled. Outside, the stars turned slowly, and the night held. By early July, the schoolhouse stood complete, whitewashed planks catching the late afternoon sun, its single bell glinting from the small cupola above. Inside, the scent of fresh sawn wood lingered. Delia stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, writing out the alphabet in careful script across the slate board. Her handwriting, once stiff from disuse, had grown steadier with each passing week. Boone leaned against the open doorway, arms crossed, watching her with a quiet pride he didn't put into words. Behind him, the wind stirred the tall grass, carrying the scent of wild sage and creek water. "You reckon they'll listen?" she asked without turning, tapping the edge of the chalk against the board. "They'll try not to," he said, "but you'll get their attention. You've got a way of making folks lean in." She turned, brushing her hands on her skirt. "I used to wonder if I could hold a room. Now I just figure I'll hold it long enough to teach them something worth keeping." He stepped inside, boots thudding softly on the pine floor. "You've already taught me a thing or two." Delia eyed him, lips tugging upward. "Like what?" "Like how much a man can miss without even knowing it." He took her hand then, folding it gently in his, and they stood there for a long moment in the hush of the empty schoolroom, sunlight warming the walls around them. That evening, they returned to the cabin with a crate of donated books strapped in the wagon. Delia unpacked them one by one: weathered readers, a few volumes of history, a tattered Bible with penciled notes in the margins. Boone brought in a bundle of dried mint she'd asked him to gather from the creek, and she tucked it into the pantry with the care of someone rebuilding a life one piece at a time. After supper, Boone spread a map across the table. It was old, creased in the corners, and speckled with candle wax. "I've been thinking," he said, pointing to a parcel of land just west of the cottonwoods. "If we clear the lower part of the pasture, there's enough room to build on. Something more than just one room and a stove." Delia sat beside him, eyes following his finger. "You mean a house? One with space for more than two," he said, glancing at her. "A porch that faces morning light. Room for a washroom, maybe even a piano someday." She rested her hand on his. "You're sure?" "I've never been more." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling deep. "Then we'll build it together." A week later, Boone filed a claim on the parcel, and they began clearing the land. Each day after her time at the schoolhouse, Delia joined him, sleeves rolled, skirts pinned up, axes swinging in rhythm. She no longer moved like someone trying to disappear. She carried herself with purpose, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found solid ground. The townspeople noticed. Mrs. Redfern began sending pies wrapped in cloth. The blacksmith's wife offered to sew curtains for the new windows. Even Sheriff Lawton stopped by during an early morning ride, tipping his hat with a rare smile. "Good to see things settled straight," he said, eyes scanning the land Boone had already begun fencing. "They're more than settled," Delia replied, brushing sawdust from her apron. By August, the schoolhouse bell rang clear across the valley, and children filed in with slates and sunburned cheeks. Delia greeted each one by name, her voice warm but firm. She carried no ruler, only a steady gaze and a willingness to listen. Boone worked the ranch during the day, fixing fences and tending the stock they'd pooled from both his herd and a small sale she'd made of the few belongings she'd brought west. In the evenings, he met her at the cabin, often with something fresh from the creek or garden: a trout, a clutch of radishes, once even a handful of wild strawberries. One evening, as summer began to tip toward fall, she returned home to find him finishing a frame of the new house. The roof beams were in place, and the walls were climbing. She set her satchel down and stood beside him, brushing her fingers over the fresh-cut wood. "I've been thinking about what should go here," she said, pointing to the north-facing room. "Tell me. A cradle, maybe, someday." Boone turned to her, his expression softening. "You want children? If they come, I'd welcome them." He took her hands, rough palm to palm. "I'd raise them with you, gentle and true." Delia looked up, eyes steady. "Then let's build more than walls. Let's build a life." That fall, under the cottonwoods, they were married with Reverend Tully presiding, and half the town gathered to watch. Boone wore a clean shirt and his best boots. Delia wore a dress stitched by Mrs. Redfern, the hem embroidered with a row of tiny violets. Afterward, they danced in the grass as the sun went down, laughter rising among fiddle tunes and the smell of spiced cider. Boone twirled her once, and when she landed in his arms, he kissed her slow, careful, certain. That night, they returned to the cabin, their home, and slept with the windows open to the sound of crickets and the scent of sage on the air. Years passed. The house by the pasture grew full, first with music, then with the small cries of a newborn girl, and later with the messy joy of crayons and muddy boots. Delia taught at the schoolhouse until others came to take her place, and Boone passed the ranch to a younger cousin when his knees began to ache in the cold. They never left Wyoming. Every anniversary, Boone carved a wooden token, a feather, a bird, a heart, and gave it to her with a kiss pressed just behind her ear. She kept them in a box by the bed, each one a testament to the years they'd built, one day at a time. In the quiet of their shared evenings, with the fire low and the wind against the shutters, Boone would still take her hand in his and hold it like he had on the day she first stayed. And Delia, once unsteady and forgotten, knew love not as rescue but as something earned, rooted deep, and blooming slow under open sky.